Okay, so you want to own a Viking longship. Here is the dream. You build a dragon-headed warship, round up 80 bearded warriors, set sail into the North Sea, and come home with chests overflowing with Anglo-Saxon gold. Free treasure, free glory, a floating shield wall for men who lived outside the law. Here is the problem. That picture, plunder for free wealth, is almost completely wrong. The most dangerous cost was not the Anglo-Saxon swords. It was not the winter storms. It was not even the risk of starving at sea. The most crushing expense was paying for the timber, the tar, and the wool before the ship ever touched a single drop of water. So let's talk about what it actually cost to own a Viking longship. Not the myth, the math. And if you enjoy history explained through its receipts instead of its legends, subscribe right now, because by the end of this you will understand why owning one of these ships bankrupted more chieftains than any enemy army ever did. One quick note before we count. Every figure here is a careful estimate, not an exact receipt, because the Vikings left us ships and sagas, not spreadsheets. The numbers are built from real archaeology and real law codes, and they are close enough to tell the true story. So let's build one from scratch and watch the money leave. First, we need a currency, because the Vikings did not really have one. In the 9th and 10th centuries, Norway and Denmark had no standardized coins stamped by a king. People traded in hack silver, chopped up chunks of silver jewelry and ingots, weighed on a scale. The basic unit of weight was the irier, roughly 24 grams of silver. But silver was for the wealthy. The real backbone of the economy walked on 4 legs and gave milk. So we are going to measure wealth the way a Viking farmer actually did. In cows. One milk cow was worth roughly 1 irier of silver. A cow was survival. It was food, it was leather, it was the line between your family, living or starving through a black northern winter. So when we convert to modern money, we are not just checking a silver price. We are asking how much labor, how much food, how much survival each purchase swallowed. By that measure, 1 irier, 1 cow, is worth roughly $1,500 today. Hold on to that. 1 irier equals 1 cow equals $1,500. We are about to spend a great deal of both. Now, here is the truth running underneath this whole story. A longship, sitting by itself, does not make money. It is not an asset. It is a liability with a sail. Wood rots, rope frays, the sail tears, iron rusts in the salt air. A 30-meter warship with 60 to 80 oars is a depreciating machine that starts losing value the moment it is finished. To own one, a single chieftain had to drain the resources of an entire region for a tool that only pays off when it is pointed at someone else's monastery at exactly the right moment. So let's start building, with the part everyone assumes is free. You probably think the biggest cost was the wood, and that the wood was basically free. Just walk into the forest and start chopping. The Vikings were surrounded by trees, after all. It is not that simple. To build a skei, a full 30-meter warship like the great longships archaeologists pulled from Roskilde Harbor, you do not want just any oak. You need curved oak. Specific trees grown into specific natural bends, because a longship's strength comes from following the grain, not cutting across it. A master builder would walk a forest for weeks, choosing individual trees the way a jeweler picks stones. Then there is the labor. This was no weekend project. Around 20 professional shipwrights worked for 7 to 9 months to finish one hull. That is roughly 40,000 hours of skilled work, and skilled hands did not work for free, even in a barter economy. The building crew alone came to about 250 irier of silver. In modern money, $375,000. To put that in perspective, the hours poured into one warship equaled the entire annual farming output of about 15 medium-sized Norwegian farms. A full year of 15 families feeding themselves redirected into one boat. But the wood and the wages were only the beginning. The next cost hides inside the walls of the ship. Iron. A longship was built clinker style, with overlapping planks riveted together, and to hold those planks, you needed nails. Not a handful. Between 7,000 and 10,000 hand-forged iron rivets for a single ship. This was the Iron Age of the North. There were no factories. The iron came from bog ore dug out of swamps, and every nail was smelted and hammered by hand, producing enough for one ship burned through around 20 tons of charcoal and kept a blacksmith's forge roaring for months. That iron and those nails cost another 120 irier. $180,000. So understand what just happened. You did not simply buy some lumber. You consumed the entire metalworking capacity of your region for the better part of a year, just to hold your planks together. So the hull is done. Surely that was the expensive part. It was not. Look up at the sail. It is a single square of woven wool, roughly 100 to 120 square meters, and it may be the most expensive object on the entire ship. That sail was made from vadmal, a tight woolen cloth. To weave one, you needed the wool of about 2,000 sheep. And then you needed people to spin and weave it, and this is where the number turns almost unbelievable. Spinning and weaving a single longship sail took 2 or 3 women working for 3 to 5 years. One sail. Around 10,000 hours at the loom. A sail was not sewn in a season. It was a multi-year industrial project passed down through the same household. The value of that sail ran between 150 and 200 IRIR. That is $225,000 to $300,000 hanging from a single mast. Let that land. The sail cost as much as the entire wooden hull, sometimes more. The most valuable part of a Viking warship was not the timber or the iron. It was the cloth, made by women whose names history mostly forgot. And the ship was constantly thirsty for tar. Pine tar sealed the hull and waterproofed the wool. A ship needed roughly 500 liters of it every season, about 30 IRIR a year, $45,000 annually just to keep the water on the outside. And here is the cold logic of it. If that sail ripped in the open ocean, your ship became a 20-ton block of floating wood with 80 exhausted men aboard and no way to move. The sail and the tar were not luxuries. They were the only insurance standing between a voyage and a coffin. Let's pause and add up what we have. Materials, iron, shipwrights, sail, and tar come to around 570 IRIR, $855,000, just to put a wooden dragon in the water. For that same silver, you could have bought an entire small Anglo-Saxon monastery outright. The grim joke is that building the ship to raid one cost about as much as the monastery itself. Now let me tell you about the moment this stops being an accounting problem and becomes a human one. Meet Thorfinn Karlsefni, an Icelandic trader and explorer. Around the year 1010, he planned a voyage west, past Greenland, toward the land the sagas called Vinland, what we now call North America. Thorfinn faced the same problem every chieftain did. He could not afford it. Not the ship, not the supplies, and certainly not wages for 60 followers on a voyage that might last years. So he did what smart Viking leaders always did. He did not hire employees. He raised capital. He formed what the Norse called a félag, a partnership. Think of it as the most dangerous startup on Earth. Each rower brought his own weapon, his own armor, and accepted his own risk of dying. In exchange, nobody drew a salary. Everybody drew a share. A slice of whatever cargo, timber, furs, and plunder the voyage carried home. It sounds elegant. It was a bloodbath waiting to happen. Because the deadliest fights on these voyages often were not against foreign enemies. They were between shareholders. The sagas and the old Icelandic law code, the Gragas, are full of these disputes. Crews turning on each other over how to split a stack of timber or a pile of sealskins, over percentages that someone swore were counted wrong. You did not just need to survive the sea and the enemy. You needed the payout high enough and the split fair enough that your own 80 armed partners did not mutiny on the way home. And if you are still here, you have seen what it costs just to put a wooden dragon into the water. But we have not touched the expense that truly destroyed jarls and chieftains. The one that arrived the moment you told 80 men to stop farming and grab an oar. Keep the core idea in mind. A Viking longship was never a floating treasure chest. It was a high-risk startup with 80 armed co-founders who could mutiny the second the yield went negative. And the bill that pushed most of them over the edge was food. Surely the crew just hunted and raided their meals along the coast. A free lunch, courtesy of the shoreline. Never. You cannot gamble the lives of 80 men on finding a village to rob before they starve. Rowing a longship is one of the most brutal jobs in human history. Each man burned somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000 calories a day. Now multiply. 80 men for a 60-day crossing of the North Sea is 4,800 daily meals you must pack before you leave. And what did they eat? Salted butter, stockfish, which is wind-dried cod, salted pork, sour ale, and yet more butter. Calorie-dense, preserved, heavy. All told, roughly 6 to 8 tons of food and fresh water loaded onto the ship. The food bill for one voyage came to about 180 IRIR, $270,000, for a single trip. That much preserved meat and butter could drain the entire winter reserves of 3 northern fishing villages. You were not just feeding a crew. You were eating the surplus meant to keep whole communities alive until spring. And it gets worse, because all that food is weight. You paid a fortune for supplies, and those very supplies cut your speed and your fighting performance by nearly 30% when the ship was fully loaded. We imagine Vikings taking whatever they wanted, but the moment they wanted to actually trade, at real markets like Hedeby, Dublin, or York, the rules changed. There were docking taxes, a landing fee that could run around 5% of your cargo's value just to tie up and sell. Pay it or you do not trade. And if your ship broke far from home, disaster. Replacing a snapped rudder in a foreign port could cost 4 times what it would have cost back in Norway. They saw a desperate crew, and they charged accordingly. But the most chilling line item was the price of a human life. Viking society ran on wergild, literally man payment. If a crew member died through the captain's bad decision, his family had the legal right to compensation. Depending on the man's standing, that meant paying 3 to 6 eirir of silver, between $4,500 and $9,000 per dead man, owed to the people back home. So the captain carried an invisible cost on every voyage. Every rower was not just a worker. He was a liability whose death you might have to pay for, in silver, to a grieving family who knew exactly what the law owed them. So let's total the whole thing. The true cost of building and running one 30-meter Skei warship for its very first year. The wood, the iron, and the shipwrights, 370 eirir, $555,000. The woolen sail and a year of tar, 200 eirir, $300,000. 60 days of food for 80 men, 180 eirir, $270,000. Consumable gear and port fees, 50 eirir, $75,000. And a reserve for the death payments you might owe, 40 eirir, $60,000. 840 eirir of silver, roughly $1,260,000, in the first year alone. Now let me anchor that. It is on the order of what it takes to run a small professional racing team for a season. It is more than the combined wealth of 120 northern farming households put together. Every family, all their land and animals in silver, stacked into one boat. And it exceeded the entire annual tax revenue of a small Norwegian kingdom like Hordaland. One chieftain's ship tossed more to run than a petty kingdom collected in a year. A Viking longship did not make you a conqueror. Owning one correctly, making certain the plunder beat the burn rate, was the one thing that separated the jarls who founded dynasties from the ones whose names were erased when their own starving crews sold the ship for scrap. It was never about lawless rage. It was a high-risk venture capital engine, and the moment the math failed, the voyage was over. So the next time you see a dragonhead slicing through the fog, don't just look at the axes and the shields. The 2,000 sheep, the 15 farms, the years at the loom, the tons of butter, and the families back home waiting to be paid if their son did not return. The raid was the easy part. The accounting is what built or destroyed an empire. If you want more history, read through its math, subscribe, and you will catch the next one. Because next time we leave the cold north for Renaissance Italy to break down what it cost to run a mercenary company where the soldiers did not fight for glory. They fought for compound interest.